first in this particular series. But we can't call the archives until about 50 years later. So to orient any possible viewers of the future, I'm William G. Reese, Chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at this institution. Dr. John Peters, Professor of Psychiatry in the department and head of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Dr. Roscoe Dykman, who's Professor of Psychiatry in this department and Director of the Behavioral Laboratory. And what your interviewers have in common, besides being in this department, in this institution, is that we have each been considerably influenced by you. You're an important mentor for each of us. Might ask you, as a beginning, what brings you to Little Rock on this most recent visit?
Well, I accept any kind of opportunity to come to Little Rock because I consider this the greatest concentration of Pavlovians in the United States, and I feel very comfortable here, and I enjoy being here with those who have been so prominent in collaborating with me in the work, and with whom I feel very much at home and very comfortable, and I feel this close relationship, and both from the professional point of view and also from the personal. I'm always glad to be here, and I think if, as I said to you, Bill, if the time comes to retire, if there's anything left to retire, I feel that I would like to. The two places I think of are here and also in England.
Well, I can't conceive of your ever retiring. You're retiring in some respects, but not so far as your scientific work is concerned.
Well, about that,
but let's mention the other people in Little Rock that you've worked with, who have worked with you.
Well, there's Newton, and then there's Murphy, with whom I've collaborated, and by visiting and talking to and down here, and with whom I've been in close contact about the work. See, those are the people down here.
Right.
I think it'd be worthwhile mentioning that it was Dr. Gantt's influence that led to the establishing of the dog laboratory over at the Little Rock Veterans Administration Hospital back in the early 60s.
That's a good lead-in. Starting at that part of the history, we can move back. Now, we've introduced everyone to some extent, except our famous guest, Dr. William Horsley Gantt. We are going to ask him to introduce himself mainly in terms of an autobiographical sketch. First, I'd like you to tell us something about your early experiences in the earlier part of your life.
Well,
beginning, since you're known for your veracity, for your date and place of birth.
What's he known for?
His veracity.
Veracity or veracity?
Well, you're so overweight that you're not very voracious, obviously. We want an honest account of the date and place of your birth.
Well, you are speaking from the beginning in a rather ambivalent way. You say that I'm noted for my veracity, and then you caution me that you want an honest account.
If we get an honest account from this, I'll be absolutely sure that you're absolutely...
Well, I was born October the 24th, 1892, and on the parcel of land that my family was granted by George II of England, and where my ancestor who came to that particular part of the country was Dr. William Cabell, who came over in 1725. I also had other ancestors who, my first one that I know came over in 1642, and then my grand ancestor came to Maryland in 1650. Not to mention my Indian connection, which I don't know when they came, since I'm supposed to be descended from some Indian princess
Named.
Pocahontas.
So as Will Rogers said, your people met our people, or your people met your people.
Well, I like to, I believe, I value the fact that I, like you, was born on a farm and had that advantage of the kind of rugged life that existed then in the South, because the South had lost everything, and all the people in the South were rather impoverished. My father died before I was 3, so I never knew my father. My mother was a school teacher, got $35 a month, and she encouraged me, since her father was a physician, she encouraged me to go into medicine. And although I wasn't rigidly determined to go into medicine, I considered other things. I was more drawn to it than other fields, and so I finally did go into medicine and graduated at the University of Virginia in 1920. I interned 2 years, and I was very much frustrated by the life of an intern and the kind of rigid schedule that they had. And I welcomed then, when I heard that physicians were wanted to do relief work in Russia under Herbert Hoover in 1922, I welcomed the opportunity to go to Russia, and left on June the 10th, 1922, intending to stay 3 months. But having met Pavlov during that time, I decided to stay on, and I felt that if I didn't break loose and break the kind of traces to the routine work in America and break loose completely, I wouldn't have the freedom to learn from Pavlov what I considered that he had to give.
But did you get into Russia via England, or what was the...
Yes, I went to England, and it was a great thrill to see things you'd read about in Mother Goose, such as London Bridge and St. Ives, and to see all those places which you really didn't feel that existed. And I went through England. I spent a couple of weeks there, and went through Germany, and first to Moscow, and to Leningrad. No, from Moscow I went down to Saratov on the Volga River, which was the center of the famine. And then I was transferred to what was then Petrograd, met Pavlov.
I see. Well, we'll get back to Pavlov in more detail later on. So let's continue the chronology for now. You did spend, after you got back into Russia again with considerable difficulty, perhaps 5 years there.
Yes. Well, while I was with the American Relief, my interpreter said to me, his name was Zelan, he'd worked with Pavlov in 1903 and 4. He spoke good English, and he said to me, well, you should go out to see Pavlov's laboratory. So he took me out October the 29th, 1922, and Pavlov showed me his experiments, and so I decided at that time, from the clarity of Pavlov's description, and I decided to start working with Pavlov, and I didn't have any, most of my life has really been without any definite plans ahead. It's been kind of living from hand to mouth. And so...
Especially when you started working at Hopkins, it was living from hand to mouth.
How did you know that he would, you could work in his lab?
Well, I requested permission.
Excuse me, we got a technical problem.
Did you say you questioned
Somebody So, let's see.
Just as we had our pause because for a technical check, Ross, you were asking a question.
Yes, I was wondering, how you knew whether Pavlov would take you and how you went about making application.
Well, I requested him. I asked his permission.
Surely, in this country, the procedures are quite formal and you have to go through. You just simply ask him.
Well, they were pretty formal back then in this country, too, I'll bet, especially in the Myurian years. But perhaps we can develop the Russian period a little bit more. So let's pick up where you're saying so long to Russia, and then what happened?
What do you mean?
After you left Pavlov, pick up at that point.
After I left Pavlov. Well, as I said, I don't think I've ever made any plans for the next year ahead in my life. I remember when I went through medicine, I never knew where the money for the next year was coming from. And I had enough money. I'd taught school a couple of years, made enough money to go through the first 2 years of medicine. And then I don't remember how I thought I was going to get through the last 2 years of medicine, but I had a cousin who had made a good deal of money. He only, in the business, and he didn't get through but the 5th grade of school, but as people didn't have much money then, he went to work for the shoe company, and he became a millionaire. And he happened to come by to see me where I was teaching school in Greensboro, North Carolina. And he talked to me about my financial situation, which was close to zero. And then
That was before the days of deficit financing.
And he asked me what money I need to get through medicine, and he volunteered to lend me that money.
So you went from one year to the next, and apparently it's proven to be a remarkably successful approach to life. But did you go directly then from Pavlov's lab to the Hopkins, or what happened in that period?
Well, I stayed on from year to year. I had the general feeling that I wanted to stay in Russia until I thought I learned what Pavlov had to teach me. And so I stretched it out. I had started working with Pavlov when I was in the American Relief Administration. And then we had to terminate that American Relief in London. And although the Bolsheviki had promised to give me a return visa when I got out of Russia, they said that everybody they worked with who were spies. And so they wouldn't let me back in. So I worked for a year in London. And then I heard it was easier to get in from Helsingfors, so I went to Helsingfors and waited 4 months there, and finally got back into Russia and didn't leave then for 4.5 years for fear they wouldn't let me back again. Then
did you write your book on the Russian situation while you were in Russia?
Well, I collected that material, and part of it when I was working with the American Relief. Then when I went to London, I worked on liver pathology in the University College Medical School, and I showed it to the man I was working with, McNee, and he said, well, this is valuable material. You ought to talk to the editor of the British Medical Journal. So this was the material that the head of the American Relief said to me, Gantt, you're just wasting your time. There won't be 6 people in the world who will ever read that. But I went on collecting it because I was interested in it myself. And also, that to me was the special interest that I had in that work was that I was interested in the effect of war and famine on disease. And I spent about 6 months traveling over Europe, collecting material from the non-combatant nations such as Sweden and Switzerland, to compare what was the disease incidence in those countries with the countries that had been at war. And that to me was an extremely interesting topic. And that was material that I collected without any idea whether it would be published or not. And I said, the editor of the British Medical Journal asked me to write that material up for the British Medical Journal. And I wrote that up in about 10 articles. And afterwards published it under the title Medical Review of Soviet Russia.
And apparently it's sold more than 6 copies.
Well, it has been the basis, for example, of the diseases, the disease incidents in Russia during that period when no one knew anything about Russia. And it's been quoted in Garrison's History of Medicine.
So this was really your first major publication?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, we'll get you to Hopkins yet, would you?
Well, now, during the winter of 29, after I'd been away about 7 years from Baltimore, I got a letter from Adolf Meyer, and who was head of the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins. And he said, well, I had attended his courses at Hopkins while I was there, but he didn't know me from that. And he said, I've heard of your work through John Dewey and Alan Gregg. Alan Gregg was head of the Rockefeller Medical Division of the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, both of those people had come to Russia, and they met me working in Pavlov's laboratory. And Adolf Meyer had a great acquaintance throughout the world with prominent figures. And they had told him, well, here was this American, this single American working there with Pavlov. And Adolf Meyer was a person who wanted, well, first he was a person with very broad interest, and then he liked a lot of window dressing too for his clinic. And he got people from various disciplines, and part of the time he got them there just to confound them and show that they were on the wrong track. I didn't know that at that time.
Sounds familiar.
And
what role did he have among you now?
well, he wrote to me that having heard of your work through Alan Gregg and John Dewey, I think we might combine our mutual urges to advantage. Well, I didn't know that that meant giving me an appointment at the Phipps.
Sounds like an indecent proposal.
Well, I didn't interpret it one way or another. And I met him in Boston when I came with Pavlov to this country, to the International Physiological Congress in 1929. And then when I told him that I thought I had an appointment to go to the Mayo Clinic with Roundtree, he pulled his goatee and made it evident that he thought he'd given me an appointment at the Phipps Clinic. And then since he volunteered to build me a Pavlovian laboratory, I didn't talk to Roundtree anymore about going to the Mayo Clinic. But I accepted this offer of Adolf Meyer's to go to Baltimore. And it's of some interest to me and I suppose also other people in deciding my salary. Adolf Meyer said to me after I got to Baltimore, well, what salary do you want? And I said, well, I don't know what it takes to live in America. And he said, well, I don't know what you pay people in my position. He said, well, we pay them between $3,000 and $6,000. Well, I said, I think probably $3,500 will be enough for me. And so we settled on that salary. But I didn't know then the system of universities, that they get you as low as they can and keep you as low as they can, too. And so it was a long time before my salary was raised to $4,500.
That must have kept you single for a while longer, didn't it?
Well, I think I got married on $3,500. Yes, I did, because I got married in 34. And I was still on 3,500.
Hopkins had this policy of when you write a paper, it had to clear all the department chairman and what happened on your first paper that you wrote and sent over to.
Well, my papers, Adolf Meyer passed my papers as long as it had nothing to do with psychiatry. But he first got annoyed when I wrote this paper on sex. And he was his cheeks turned red when he read that. And he challenged me on that. And then I wrote this...
was that canine sex or some other kind?
Well, that was canine. And I was rather unsophisticated. And then I wrote my material. I gathered my material together in this book, Experimental Basis for Neurotic Behavior, which he held up because it had a good deal to do with sex in it, and I couldn't publish it until after he retired.
He was in favor of neurosis without sex.
For how long would he hold up a thing like that?
Forever, I suppose.
4 or 5 years?
Well, I suppose he'd hold it up completely.
Well, you have, what, maybe 200 publications by now, a few books scattered in between. How did you get any of that stuff through?
Well, Adolf Meyer finally retired.
You had a great avalanche of publications. Well, we want to get to your...
Well, I didn't feel resentful on that, much for that. I felt that the head of the department, if you elected to work with a certain person, but then you accepted his judgment about a lot of things. And if you didn't want to accept his judgment, you went somewhere else. Now that was...
I don't buy either of those premises, but that's okay.
That's a European idea.
You should buy the first one.
What?
Just admonish you to buy the first one anyway.
And I think it makes sense. I mean, you got an integration. I mean, we talk a lot about integration. You get an integration of purpose and by that method. And that was, and also Hopkins inherited that method from Germany, since nearly all the chief people studied in Germany.
But you never got anxious about being scooped or about having your work done?
No, you had a great security there. I mean,
we'll get to some of the famous personalities, or infamous, in a little more detail a little bit later on. We're trying to get a sort of a telescopic picture now of your career. So you established the Pavlovian laboratory at Hopkins and worked productively there for many years until when was your first retirement from Hopkins?
well, when I got to be 65, time for retirement, the dean was concerned about what would happen to me. Turner was the dean at that time, and he had some conversation. He was much more concerned than Waddell. And so he talked. It's amazing to me that I don't consider that I'm all that immaterial, but for some reason, I've never been concerned about the future, what's going to happen to me in the future. And I don't mean to say that I don't have an interest in material goods, and I would perhaps rather have a better driving automobile than this Pinto that I'm driving around in now, I've never thought that, I've never had the idea. What's that?
I say, are you a VW at home?
Well, I like the VW. But I've never had an idea that I wouldn't in some way be supported. I mean, because the kind of sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. And
There's a little evil in universities here and there, too, isn't there?
what?
There's a little evil in universities here and there.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, everything is not exactly right in the universities, and I didn't like at the university. You at the time that it got to be very difficult to live on 4,500. I knew that certain people who had graduated recently and were working under me were getting paid considerably more, but it was because they knew that these people would leave if they didn't pay them more.
Yes.
Now that kind of thing, I mean, I wouldn't say that I wasn't to a certain degree resentful of that, but it didn't bother me enough to try to get to go somewhere else.
Right. Well, you retired temporarily from Hopkins at the age of 65,
Yes.
is that right? And that was a pretty brief retirement.
Well, during that time, of course, I'd worked with you at Perry Point, and beginning 1950, wasn't it? And so, as consultant. Then in Washington, what was his name? Casey, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Casey.
Casey.
Yes, he knew about my working down there. And I've forgotten exactly how I found out from him that a possibility of going there. And I went up to Washington. Anything Whitehorn hadn't come through, although Turner had been goading Whitehorn to do something about keeping me on at Hopkins after my retirement. Whitehorn hadn't come through with anything definite. And so I went over to talk to Casey, and Casey offered to build a laboratory at Hopkins, or he offered me the opportunity to come down here with you. Well, I felt that it was a big move to leave the laboratory at Hopkins and pull up roots there. And so then I made the choice of going down to Perry Point full time when I got to be 65. But Turner then invited me to continue to direct the Pavlovian laboratory in Baltimore. Now, an interesting thing about that Pavlovian laboratory in Baltimore, some people came over from NIH. It was during the era pretty close to it of the MacArthur regime. And some people came over from NIH and said they were considering supporting the Pavlovian laboratory in Baltimore. And they said, well, we don't like that. You should change the name from Pavlovian. Of course, at that time, there was a great prejudice against anything Russian. And they indicated that if the name were changed, they would support it. Well, I always respect Turner for coming out and saying, well, we like that name, and that's the name it will be.
Well, I suppose your first expensive laboratory was paid for by funds from the National Heart Institute, was it not?
Yes. Now, when you and I were working there, you came there in 1950?
Yeah, I had a salary, a magnificent salary of $3,600 a year.
Now you know the origin.
But that was paid by the National Institute of Mental Health because you only had a budget of about $6,000 a year.
Well, I had a budget of $11,000 at Hopkins, which covered everything. My salary, all employees, dogs, all instruments. I suppose until, along about the time that you came.
I remember going and asking you for a raise, and you told me not to worry about the future. You never worried about it, why should I?
They treated you both very well.
Right.
Well, until about the time that you came there. Now, as you know, and you worked with me on it, and all three of you did. Bill and I worked with Perry Point, and in sacrogalvanic conditioning and also cardiac, and P.D. worked on it, cardiac rate in humans, so all of us worked together on cardiac rate. Now, I started my interest in that about 1935, and I met at Curtis Box in Philadelphia, who was a friend of mine. I met the head of the Williams, who was head of the Brush Development Company, and I wanted something to measure heart rate. Well, he offered to lend me an instrument that would record the heart rate. It was kind of a modified EKG. So he gave me an instrument that at that time cost about $300. And we used that, I suppose, about 7 or 8 years at one instrument for recording heart rate. And then when that wore out, I sent it back to the Brush Development Company. Well, they gave me what they call lending on Memo, which was really a gift. They gave me another instrument, which at that time I think cost $600. So, and when that wore out, they lent me a similar instrument. So, I suppose up until and including the number of years that you were there, the only instrument that we had to measure heart rate was an instrument that if I'd paid for it, it would cost $650. But since it was loaned to me all along, it was free. And so practically all of our fundamental work on heart rate was done with this one instrument. And the instruments that you devised for measuring blood pressure.
Worsley, when I first saw your lab, it was up on top of the old physiology building, and I remember you bounding up there several floors.
Flights.
If they had an elevator in any building, I don't think you ever rode it. But what I remember is it was just terribly hot up there.
In the summer.
In the summer. I went back a few years later, and there was air conditioning. And could you tell us how that came about?
Well, I think it was air conditioning in one room. I don't think there was air conditioning.
Dr. Whitehall didn't think he needed air conditioning.
No. As I recall it, the reason he got air conditioning finally is that the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals insisted on it for the animals which were immediately adjacent to his
some of our
office.
Some of our animals died on account of the heat.
So you finally had some bootleg air conditioning from the dog. Well, we've avoided your scientific work. We've just hit a few high points of your interesting, productive career. You mentioned some famous personalities along the way, Alan Gregg, Adolph Meyer, some others, Pavlov, Paramount. I'd like to ask Pete to talk with you a bit about some of these famous or perhaps infamous people that you've worked closely with. I think I'd like to suggest a short intermission before we do that. Would you like to get out from under the Krieg lights for a while?
Well, maybe it will be too big a change when I come back.
Well, if you're prepared to go ahead, let's just trade seats here and ask Peter to continue.
Take a drink of that water. That was
Somebody tipped it over.
I'll go get another.
Get them over here.
That's
warm, but not water.
relatively cool.
Continue.
Well, I would like to ask you some questions about Pavlov. You have already indicated you were very much attracted to his work and to the way he explained his work to you. Did you see in that work something especially relevant to one of your fields of interest?
Well, as I mentioned, I first started working with Pavlov on some items of interest that I had had from what I had done in this country. I had been using a method of what we call non-surgical biliary drainage, of putting a duodenal tube down the patient and then injecting through the tube. The tube got into the duodenum, injecting magnesium sulfate. Well, and they considered that you did get a small floor bowel from that. Well, they considered that the magnesium sulfate caused the gallbladder to contract, and the ampulla fata, where the bowel comes out into the intestine, to relax. And I was interested in what was the mechanism of this, because it was the basis for using this method was a footnote by Meltzer, who was working at the Rockefeller Institute, that he saw that when magnesium sulfate was put on the duodenum, I think of the dog, under anesthesia, it caused an expulsion. I don't know whether it was anesthesia, must have been. Caused an expulsion of bile. Well, the whole thing was built up on that. And I wanted to know how it worked. So I first talked with one of Pavlov's assistants, Volbert, who spoke very good English, and told him I'd like to work out the mechanism of that. So he was an accomplished physiologist, knew all the surgical methods, so he said, well, we can find it out by making a tiroidal fistula, where you have a loop of intestine, and you isolate that loop of intestine, and you put magnesium sulfate directly into the intestine and see directly whether it causes an expulsion of bile. Well, from those experiments, it turned out that it causes a minimal expulsion of bile, and like many medical things, this was had a false basis, and it just became traditional, just because somebody had written about it, and somebody who had a lot of influence and made propaganda for it, and it got to be a very popular method of treatment. And he showed, well, this had been known before, but he also demonstrated in this experiment that the natural stimuli for bile, which are food and milk and acid gastric juice, are much more powerful than this magnesium sulfate. So that's what I started working on my own in Pavlov's lab.
But
while I was with the American Relief.
But there was something about his work that especially interested you as to maybe some application.
Yes.
About
well,
conditional reflex work.
When I saw Pavlov's demonstration to me, it was October the 29th, 1922, and Pavlov demonstrated with great clarity how you could measure quantitatively the correlates of excitation and inhibition. And it seemed to me that here was a possibility of studying nervous diseases, and that Pavlov had reduced to great simplicity very complex phenomena. And on account of this brilliant, what seemed to me an extremely brilliant experiment, and which I thought in the future might be able to throw a great deal of light on psychiatric diseases, I decided it was worth my while to stay and work with Pavlov and learn his methods in this.
Were you more attracted to him than his work, or what was there about him that really attracted you?
Well, I mean, his work was revealed through the way that he showed it, and it was hard to separate the two. Of course, Pavlov was an extremely dynamic person. He illustrated, he explained it very carefully. It was through an interpreter, through this Dr. Zellheim, and he explained it very carefully, but through his clarity and dynamic personality, he was able to convince me of the usefulness of this method that he had.
What was Pavlov like to work with? What kind of was he a harsh person, a difficult person to deal with?
Well, he wasn't, you can answer that in two ways. Pavlov was a very simple person in his likes and dislikes in his life. On the other hand, he was a very positive person, and his manner was very dogmatic, but he wasn't really dogmatic in his teaching. But he asserted himself very strongly for the things he believed in, very clearly, very strongly. There was no shades. Things were black and white for him. There were no shades in between. The thing was either right or it was wrong. And he stood squarely for what he considered right. And one expression of his character was his ability to resolve a very complex phenomenon into a very simple experiment where things could be measured.
Did this lead, say, like in the Wednesday conferences that he had for so many years, did this lead to a certain amount of fear in his colleagues about expressing themselves?
Well, I would call it more awe than fear. For example, Pavlov had, among the 50 people that he had working with him as collaborators, about 2 or 3 of those were communists. Now, Pavlov, at that time, from 1922 until, well, the height of his detestation of the pronouncements against the Bolshevik government were in that period. Pavlov would speak very strongly against what the Bolsheviks were doing, and he did everything he could to protest what they were doing. And when he wanted to say something bad about them, he tried to wait until one of these 3 communists were there to hear him. He said, for example, to Fyodorov, who was one of the 3, he said to him, okay, Fyodorov, I think you're an honest man, but I don't see how you can be a communist at the same time. And Fyodorov wouldn't say anything. Now, Pavlov just overawed people with his vehemence, although, I mean, he wouldn't take any action against you if you spoke back, but most people would just be subdued by his manner.
Well, he was supported by the Bolshevik government, was he not?
Yes, well, everything was. I mean, if there wasn't support from the Bolshevik government, there wouldn't be any support. And Pavlov was supported better than most of the
Did he ever quarrel with any of the Russian leaders, write to them? Or?
Well, he, for example, he quarreled with them all along. I mean, when they said, for example, he took issue and published a piece, there was a piece published in the Soviet paper that Pavlov said that the Bolshevik were on the wrong track, that they said that certain qualities were conditional reflexes. He said certain qualities that they were trying to change were unconditional reflexes, and they couldn't be changed. And he said that they were on the wrong basis because they considered that they could be changed, but that unconditional reflexes, which were inherited, could not be changed. And he also, when, for example, there were so many instances of how he wouldn't have anything to do with them or denounce them, Buharin, who was the head, I think, head of education, the agency that was Minister of Education, who was supporting Pavlov's lab, came to see Pavlov's lab on a site visit, and Pavlov wouldn't let him in.
Well, did he not, when he got up into his 80s, didn't he soften to the government and express some appreciation to them?
Yes, he, now in 1933, I saw Pavlov. I left Russia after in August 1929. I went back to see Pavlov, and Pavlov was very much against him in 29. I went back to see him in 1933. And I said to him, why aren't you so severe against the Bolsheviks as you used to be? And he said, my heart is giving me a little trouble, and he said it's too hard on my heart to cuss them out the way I used to. Now, in 1935, at the time of the International Physiological Congress, which was held in Moscow and Leningrad, Pavlov made statements that he acknowledged the assistance of the Soviet government to science, and he said that he hoped to see the success of the government. Now, the explanation of that, I think, was he saw the war. Pavlov was a great patriot. He saw the war clouds looming on the horizon with Japan and with Germany, and that stimulated Pavlov's patriotism. And of course, they had supported science very well, and especially Pavlov's lab.
I've heard you speak before about how Pavlov spent the summers, and that's always been intriguing, and I think is intriguing to us academic university people. What would he do in the summer? What was his philosophy about closing the lab and so on?
Yes. Well, the lab wasn't closed because some people still work there, but Pavlov would take off 1 or 2 months, go to the country. He wouldn't study physiology, wouldn't have anything to do with the work, the physiological work. And he took that time off rest and recreation and especially physical exercise.
Well, you visited him there. What did you find him doing?
Well, he was very fond of this Russian peasant game called Gorotki, which is a very strenuous game. And you throw a heavy stick, which is it's made out of green wood, and it's heavier than a baseball bat, about that length. You throw it a long distance to knock out little pegs of wood, little blocks of wood that are made by the peasants. I mean, it originated as a peasant game, and it was very strenuous. And Pavlov would play that game in the summer. Of course, it doesn't get dark until about 11 o'clock. And Pavlov would play it from 7 in the morning until taking time off for meals until 10 or 11 at night. And he would outplay anybody else there. And I've seen him play for 3 or 4 days, and other people just coming there would be so sore that they couldn't play after about the third day. I remember that Pavlov and about one other was the only ones left that were able to play. On the 4th day, Pavlov wanted to get people to play, but he was the only one that...
But did you learn to play Gorotki?
Yes, I played it some. But I couldn't continue as long as Pavlov.
Did he like to take walks like you do?
Well, he walked from the laboratory to his house, and that was about 3 miles, I suppose. He walked back and forth. He refused the offer of sometimes he'd take the tramway. He refused the offer of an automobile by the Soviet government. Later on, I think, in the 30s, I believe, after he was in the 80s, after he was 80, he died at 86. I think he did accept the automobile, but he didn't for a long time.
Sounds like he was an aggressive sort of person, but humble at the same time.
Yes, he was. You know, in his last will and testament, he wrote these 3 rules, and one of them is humility. Don't be vain, he says, on account of vanity. You will lose your sense of proportion, and you will not accept useful advice. And so he had a practiced humility. Although, I mean, his character wasn't one of humility, but he did recognize it as a virtue, just as in his early life, he was a non-religious person, although he went to the theological seminary when he was about 18, I believe, 18 or 19. But he discontinued that after a year and went to Petersburg to university. He was the son of a priest and the grandson of a sexton who was a peasant. And he was really non-religious until the Bolsheviks started persecuting the church. And then he stood up for religion.
But you say he was non-religious, but in terms of the qualities we think of as making a good moral man, he was not lacking at all, was he?
Oh, no, he wasn't. He was extremely honest. But his wife was very religious. And Pavlov, he, from a theoretical ground, in his last years, he espoused religion. And he said, well, even not long before he died, he said, life would be much happier and easier with religion. And he said that he didn't envy anyone except his wife, her religious faith.
Do you have a close relationship with his wife?
Oh, yes. His wife did everything for him. Pavlov was very incapable of doing any practical things for himself. Even, I mean, he said he couldn't buy a railway ticket for himself. And he was very impatient in many ways. And for example, when he'd go into a barber shop to get a beard trim, he would sit there very quietly with this sheet around him for about 3 minutes. And then he would jump up and run around the room shaking his fist and say, how long you want to keep me here, you know, and just like a child in a temper tantrum. And circle the room and then finally come back and sit down for another few minutes. And he was very impatient in that way.
But did he show this in the laboratory?
Well, he did in some ways. He did when he was operating. Now, he didn't.
You mean he would demand instruments and...
Yes. Now, he would sit for hours and observe a dog, or sit with the collaborator who was observing a dog. And he could sit for hours without any kind of... without getting agitated. But when he was operating, he was the best, speediest, most skillful surgeon I've ever seen, and I've seen some of the best at Hopkins. He would, you know, he was extremely speedy and agile, and people couldn't hand him instruments fast enough, you know, and he would operate so fast you couldn't see what he was doing. And every now and then, you know, he would stop and start bawling them out, you know, and, well, he made Our Bailey nervous that way. And made Our Bailey, Our Bailey was the chief assistant, and Our Bailey just resigned, got so upset about it, he resigned from the lab. And Pavlov came around to his apartment and apologized most humbly and said, don't pay any more attention to me than the dog's barking. And asked him to come back, which he did.
This has been characteristic of some great surgeons, isn't that right? Their irritability at the operating table.
Except for the apology.
Which was lacking in most cases, I suppose.
I don't know about the apology.
Well, I'm curious about how Pavlov negotiated with a collaborator and a pupil as to what projects he would do, what research he would do. Was this something that he handed out, like
Well,
you do this and you do that?
Pavlov would assign the problems to work on. And if you wanted to work on something else and discussed it with Pavlov, he would permit it in cases that I know, but otherwise the work of Pavlov went along as teamwork.
Well, for instance, I wonder about your gallbladder work in the beginning. Was this because you were an American and you were just being introduced into the lab that he allowed you to do this?
No, he would allow. Philbert was doing it with me. He would allow someone to do it, but he wouldn't take an interest in it.
I see.
I mean, if this wasn't, you see, Pavlov had stopped gastrointestinal work. Mainly, there was a little going on when I was there, but he stopped that about 1910 and went over to conditional reflex. And Pavlov was a person who put his enthusiasm mainly into one thing at the time. And so when I was there, it was mainly conditional reflex. Now, Pavlov allowed other people to work on other things. But if you worked on those things, Pavlov wouldn't take an interest in them. I mean, he didn't, he would discuss them a little, but it wasn't the center of his interest. But he would give you the dogs and facilities, but people didn't work much. There was some work going on. I mean, Savage and Fulbert was they were doing some gastrointestinal work. But, and Spiratsky was doing other things, but Pavlov, people were just drawn to Pavlov, and they would naturally do what Pavlov was interested in. I mean, Pavlov was a figure, I don't know of any such figure through the ages. I mean, he was an amazing figure. And he stood for truth, and he didn't... You had a feeling that Pavlov never counted the cost of anything, that he asserted what he considered right, and that he just went along in that path, and fortunately for Pavlov, he drew people to him. And the Bolsheviki, on account, he had a great international character. Well, first having won the Nobel Prize in 1903, and that was not for the conditional reflex, but it was just that dynamism and the force of his personality and the clarity of his writing, and that he drew people to him around him. Of course, it didn't always work.
Horsley, I think we can pass on now from Pavlov and now talk some about your unusual life and your unusual contact with people.
Not too intimately, but unusually.
Well, you're a very interesting group of friends that you've had over the years, and one of the ones that comes to mind first would be Dos Passos. And I would wonder if you'd tell us something about your first acquaintance with him.
Well, just to say a word in the way of preamble, it's interesting, you know, how certain rumors can get going about a person that are so fantastic. Now, I remember a fellow that came up to Perry Point and wrote a long article about me for Esquire, and he said that I swam the Chesapeake and back 3 times a week. And
I would believe it myself.
well, and it's just interesting.
And the truth of the matter was you only swam halfway out and back.
The truth of it is that I only go swimming a few minutes, sometimes once a week, all during the winter, if I can get in, if the ice is not too thick.
But you actually do go in the Chesapeake with you.
Well, I go in, but I mean, somebody published, you know, 100 years later, that somebody swam the Chesapeake and back. I mean,
Well, but you'd be in good company about George Washington throwing the dollar across the Potomac.
Well, Das Passes I met in Russia in 1927, and there were very few people who came to Russia at that time, and I met practically everybody who did come because it was so rare, and then most people who came to Russia, they had a letter of introduction to me, or they knew about me, and so Das Passes and Hilders and most of those people I met that way. I was one of 3 Americans in Petrograd, later Leningrad. The other 2 were people who were about my age now, who had been there from their early life, and one was an old millionaire, had been a millionaire, made very little. And the other one was Miss Bach, who was a school teacher in the royal family and been there long before the revolution. But I met Das Passes accidentally. He was at that time very much interested in the Soviet experiment in the brave new world, and he came there to see what it was like. And I met him up at the Европейский hotel, where I went occasionally to get something to eat and get a good meal. And so he wanted to go down to the Caucasian Mountains. I'd been there before, and so we decided to go together and to walk across well, we didn't know how we were going to get across, but the idea was to go across the Caucasian Mountains. At that time, there was practically no official transportation, and you had to rent mules or horses or carts or whatever to go the 250 miles from the northern part of the Caucasian Mountains to the southern. So that was my first meeting with him, and on the basis of going together and meeting there, he, although I never agreed with his political opinions, and I remember discussing Bolshevism and what was going on in Russia, and trying to tell him some of the dreadful things that were happening. And he couldn't be convinced that it wasn't the kind of best of all possible worlds, and he had to learn for himself. But we took this walk across the Caucasian Mountains, sleeping on floors and hard floors, and getting practically nothing to eat for about a week, and because we went in places where the people themselves had hardly anything to eat. We heard about that when we crossed from one military road to another, that this place, Zaramag, would be flowing with milk and honey, and we got there after having nothing to eat in about 3 days in between, and the people didn't have anything to sell you. And in the first place we came to, they killed a sheep, and which was a custom, and we sat up at night until they had it cooked, which was about 1 o'clock, and I remember being so sleepy, and the sheep was so tough you could hardly chew it. But that was a mark of their hospitality, and they wouldn't take money for it. And then we did get to Zaramag, and we were looking forward to this, all we'd get to eat in Zaramag. And when we got there, it was a cold rain and a drizzle. It was high up in the mountains, about, I suppose, about 10,000 feet. And we found they did locate a store there, and all they had was about 3/4 of a pound of hard candy and about 6 eggs. And that was all they had to eat. And we were so dismayed. And we went back and slept on the floor in the schoolhouse that the school teacher furnished us with some hot water. to make tea, but we didn't have anything to make the tea out of, so...
You didn't buy the eggs that were...
Oh, yes, we bought the eggs and the candy too, but... and we were very... Well, you can imagine how dismayed we were when we had expected for a week to get everything there was to eat there. And so then we continued on for about another 3 days down to the southern coast. And there they did have a good deal to eat. They had oranges and they had tropical fruits. And so that was my first acquaintance with Das Passes. When he left Russia, he gave me his shoes and a suit that he had, and it was very difficult to buy anything of that nature in Russia. And so he gave me some of his clothes, which helped me out a lot. And then when I came back to America in 1929, I went to see him up on Cape Cod, and we were very devoted friends until he died about 2 years ago.
He was a famous author when you met him in Russia? Or?
Yes, he was well known then. He had written Manhattan Transfer and Three Soldiers, and he was a very well-known author. And he was well known in Russia because of his liberal views, and otherwise they wouldn't have let him into Russia.
But he became progressively more conservative as he got older.
Well, then, yes, when he saw he went to Spain helping the loyalists, he and Hemingway, and well, a number of people did. Well, one of his very close friends who taught Spanish at Hopkins also went there to help the loyalists. He was Spanish. And he was executed by the communists. Well, what I saw there turned him definitely against the communist regime, and that was in the early 30s. And so he became disenchanted with them from that time on. And he became progressively more anti-communist. And until at the end of his life, he was extremely on the extreme right. I mean, he was supporting people like William Buckley. He never supported the John Birches, but he never got that far. But he really got very much on the other side.
Did you and he discuss politics much? Was that not part of your...
we discussed politics, and we discussed free will, and I remember in my notes saying that we discussed free will, and he wrote in his autobiography called The Best Times, he wrote about our trip across the Caucasian Mountains together. Das Passes was a great friend, and he didn't let political opinions or any opinions really get in the way of friendship. He said he didn't see why a person wouldn't have a right to whatever opinions they wanted, and why it should interfere with friendship. And I think he illustrated the best qualities of what a good friend was. For example, another example of his friendship. Now, during the MacArthur regime, I was accused of, I was in the VA at Perry Point then. I was accused of being subversive on such flimsy ground as you were on the mailing list of the Maryland Free State Bookshop, and such things as that. And another was that you were in such and such a meeting in New York, and in this meeting you had an opportunity to meet communists. Now, this meeting they referred to was a meeting of the Russian War Relief, and it was during the war, about 1944 or 43. And I looked up, as you know, Ross, I have kept a great deal of material that came to the laboratory. So, and so third-class mail and so forth. So I finally unearthed some material on this meeting, and I saw that George Marshall, who was chief of staff then, was one of the people at the meeting, and the vice president, Wallace, was also at the meeting, and Eisenhower was invited, but Eisenhower was in Europe fighting the Germans at that time, and he sent back a telegram that he was sorry he couldn't attend, but he thought that every good patriotic American should be there. And so I wrote all this material to them, and I read many of my friends. I told Aspasis the night before, we were discussing McCarthy, and I said, McCarthy's doing a lot of harm, and Das said, no, I don't think he is. He's doing a good thing getting these people out. Well, the next day I got this letter, telling me that I was subversive. And so I showed it to Das. Well, he was infuriated, and he was determined to do anything he could to clear me of that. He said he would syndicate a column, and that he, well, a number of my friends, that was one of the things that gave me great confidence in friendship. Hamilton Owens, who was editor of The Sun, he was a very wise person. Now, he advised me to get the most reactionary people to support me.
And The Sun was the Baltimore newspaper.
Yes. And because he knew that they wouldn't pay any attention to liberal people, so he got the most reactionary people, and also people like Ober, who introduced a very restrictive bill in the American legislature prohibiting anybody who had anything to do with communism of being employed by the state. And he got Ober to defend me. And then Ober managed it very cleverly and got, we made up a list of 20 people who, some very conservative people like William Henry Chamberlain, who would write letters for me, substantiating the fact that I wasn't, never been interested in communism. Bill, you were one of the people that wrote a letter for me. And don't you remember?
You mean when the arch conservative Duke?
Arch.
Well, well, now, that heartened me so much about friends. I thought it was a time that, Hiss had, they found out that he was a person who was respected in Baltimore. And they found out that it turned out that he was really playing in with the communists. Now, I thought to myself, well, how do these people know? How can they be assured that I'm not doing something with the communists? And the fact that these people, just for pure friendship, were willing to support me really gave me, heartened me almost more than anything that has ever happened in my life. And because there was only one person out of the whole list of people that knew me well and that we wrote to for letters, there was only one person who refused. And I was very disappointed that he did. And that really gave me more of a firm feeling of how your friends will stick by you in time of need. And people like Arnold Richard Hopkins and Hamilton Owens and a number of those people that wrote letters for me substantiating the fact that they'd never known me to be subversive.
Didn't they accuse you of having bought a teapot in some little communist shop?
Well, they said that you bought things at the Maryland Free State Bookshop. Well, I looked up some literature I'd gotten in ads from the Maryland Free State Bookshop, which may have been run by communists. And I said, yes, I did. I said, I remember buying a teapot there. And
That's communistic to buy a teapot.
Well, I remember what Pastor said about friendship. He said he didn't see why political opinions or any opinions or differences about things should interfere with friendship. And I have kind of made a list of qualities that I consider at the basis of friendship, and one is tolerance of another person's point of view and opinions. A friend is usually a person you enjoy being with, and then a friend is a person who really doesn't count the cost of standing up for you when you need it. And I think friends and friendship are what has meant more to me in my life than almost any other thing.
Who were some of the other people that you would count among your friends, say in Europe? Weren't there some?
Well, let me just say one more word about this. At the same time that I was accused of being subversive by the McCarthy group in this country, they published a little pamphlet on me in Russia, which was called Experimental Neuroses in the USA. And they said that although I claimed to be a leader of the Pavlovians here, I was actually very much an anti-Pavlovian. And they said my work, my research work, was really designed to support the capitalistic system.
Is that because it had a genetic overtone to it, or?
Well, it was just because, it was because they wanted to accuse anything that they could of being, in America, of being anti-Pavlovian. It was part of falling in with the Stalin line of accusing everything outside of Russia. However, I must say that I've had good friends in Russia, and I've had staunch friends in Russia. Now, Bykov, at that time, he was over here at a physiological congress, and although I don't go along with all of his scientific work, I think they're errors. Bykov, you know, he never faltered in his friendship toward me, and he invited me soon after that to come and lecture in Russia. So the friends I've had have not been confined to one country.
Bykov was a member of the Russian Parliament.
No, he wasn't a member of the Communist Party.
But he was a member of the Parliament?
No, well, they don't have any Parliament.
Or there was something comparable?
Well, he was a member of higher scientific committees.
I see.
And his work was, he was well thought of by the powers in the government in Russia. And he led what was popular in Russia at that time, while we were doing the McCarthy accusations over here, Bykov was also accusing people in Russia of not following Pavlov, because Stalin's, and Bykov was playing in with the government at that time, because Stalin wanted to, his idea was to show that everything that was Russian was better than anything that was not Russian, non-Russian. So the idea was that to show that anybody who was in Russia had the right line, and people who were in Russia should not quote or not say anything, not pay any attention to people who were outside of Russia. And that was the way that they accused me of being anti-Pavlovian. It was just playing in with Stalin's political. And at the same time, it's interesting, it's simultaneous with their accusing me here of being pro-Russian and subversive. they were officially accusing me in Russia of being anti-Pavlovian and being linked up with the capitalists in this country. Now, you say about other people that...
Yes, what were some of the other people in Europe that you considered friends?
Well, let's see, I met a number of the scientists in Europe, such as Sherrington, but I didn't know them very well.
What was Sherrington's reaction to Pavlov's conditioning?
Well, he looked on it rather askant and thought it was, Pavlov was wasting his time. He wrote Pavlov back. It's interesting, the Russians sent me a book, well, I found it last spring. It had been on my desk sometime, but I hadn't opened it. It was some letters of Pavlov. And there was a letter from Sherrington in 1916, writing to Pavlov. Sherrington at that time was in Liverpool, professor of physiology. And he hadn't gotten the Nobel Prize then. And he wrote to Pavlov, asking Pavlov if he would give him a letter of recommendation for the post at Oxford. And Granit, who was over here last winter, I told him that Granit wrote a biography of Sherrington, and I told him about this letter that Sherrington wrote to Pavlov, and he didn't believe it, but I gave him a copy. I photostated a copy of the letter from the book. So they were friends, but Sherrington kind of took with a grain of salt the conditional reflex. I don't think Sherrington understood behavioral work. You know, he worked with the spinal reflexes altogether. But I don't, I don't know of any very world-renowned people I knew in Europe.
Why did Bernard Shaw have such a...
Bernard Shaw, yes.
such a
I met Bernard Shaw, but I wouldn't say that I knew him. But, well, Bernard Shaw was... well, I don't know why Bernard Shaw was anti-Pavlovian, but you know, he'd written some book about excoriating Pavlov, and Bernard Shaw was against so many things. And I met Bernard Shaw at Lady Astor's, and Lady Astor tried to get me and Bernard Shaw together, and finally Bernard Shaw kind of exploded and said, well, Pavlov's the biggest fool I ever heard of. He said, any Bobby can tell you about a dog secreting saliva.
Were you able to straighten him out?
Well, I don't think I straightened him out. He had a sense of humor.
Did he listen to you?
Yes, he would listen. I mean, he was a good listener, and so
yeah, but he had kind of a beard like Pavlov. He must.
I said, well, Mr. Shaw, you and Pavlov are very much alike. He kind of chuckled, you know, and said, yes, I've heard so. My wife was sitting in between Lord Lothian and Bernard Shaw, and she thought the easier of the two to talk to was Lothian, who was afterwards ambassador to this country, and she started talking to Lothian. And Lothian said to her, little girl, your job is to entertain Mr. Shaw.
About your wife?
Yes.
Yeah. He must have been very difficult to entertain.
Well, Lady Astor seemed able to entertain him. Well, people I've met over here, I've known a number of litterateurs. such as Henry Macon, who lived in Baltimore, and John Marquand. I knew John Marquand pretty well, and met other people such as Sinclair Lewis, and a good friend of mine was Reese, who wrote a video about Russia. At Macon, I saw a video of him when he was in Baltimore. He was rather shy, and he didn't like crowds, and he was very shy in a crowd. He liked a small, intimate group.
Was he cynical in a small intimate group?
Well, yes, he was rather cynical and satirical. And he usually enjoyed making fun of things. Some college, during the Depression, well, I heard Macon told this in my house, and I heard Macon say that these people, there was some rather leftist college in Oklahoma, I think it was Oklahoma. They wrote to Macon, they had the wrong idea of Macon, and I think they had some religious, it seemed to me that it was some religious, radical, sort of a liberal group, and just started up. And they wrote to Macon for some contribution money. And Macon wrote them back. He said he was sorry he couldn't give them a contribution, but he'd pray for them.
Did you know Ogden Nash?
Oh yes, I knew Ogden Nash fairly well, and he visited in my house, especially during the last 2 years of his life. He wrote a little inscription in the book, inscribed Horsley. Said, "No, I'm tired. I'm tired." And inscribed to Horsley, politely, not coarsely. "I'm tired of boys." I forgot the last line. He said, Ogden Nash said that, I asked him about how he decided to go into portrait. He said, well, he'd been interested in writing poetry when he was a youth. And since he couldn't be a great poet, he decided that he'd rather be a good bad poet than a bad good poet.
Well, I certainly, as I think back on the days I spent in Baltimore, I remember all the exciting times we had over at your house. Once every week, it was always a surprise to go there and see what new guest or what new person you'd get to meet. And I certainly look back on it as one of the most fascinating things in my life.
I do too. I suppose the period, I suppose, that influenced me the most. It was always very exciting to go over to your house and enjoy the tremendous hospitality that you and your family always expressed.
Well, I think that different from the way that a lot of Baltimore people think that you don't have to entertain lavishly, that you get the right people together and everything goes all right. And Dos Passos also entertained very simply. I mean, he'd have some good wine, but often he did the cooking. And so his entertainments were very simple. He didn't like crowds, and he was very shy about talking, and he would, but he was an excellent listener. And people would say to me after the evening, and Dos would have hardly said a word, but he would listen very carefully and attentively. And people would say to me, oh, what a charming conversationalist Mr. Dos Passos is. How interestingly he talks. Well, it was because he listened to them.
Did he talk much to you? This was
Yes,
my
we
impression
used
of him,
to.
that he hardly said a word.
Well, we used to take walks together, and even after he had his heart trouble, we'd take walks together, and we'd discuss everything, you know, from gravitation to the speed of light, and things in physics and Skinner, and he said Skinner was a charming fellow, and he said, but he didn't like really what Skinner stood for. He said that Skinner wrote deceptively well.
Almost as if this would be somebody could be taken in. Was that
Yes, that was the idea. And Das was very much against, especially in his later years, he was very much against materialism, and he also against the idea of Skinner, of the external environment determining everything. And he recognized Pavlov's greatness, because I never heard him say anything against Pavlov. But he, especially, he said that, well, he told me he enjoyed meeting Skinner very much when he met him at the Pavlovian Society. And he said he was a charming fellow, but he was certainly against that idea of the external environment determining everything.
Well, you've known Skinner pretty well yourself, haven't you?
Well, I've known him, just met him at Pavlovian meetings and corresponded with him, and I've seen him several times in Boston, and I think I know what he...
Do you feel like he's made much of a contribution to American psychology?
Well, I think, I mean, I respect Skinner's honesty. I don't think Skinner has a great insight, nor a great intuition. And I think Skinner has emphasized what the external environmentalists have. And I don't see that he's added anything to what John B. Watson said.
Horsley, would you say he's a great operator? You know, we mentioned the Pavlovian Society, which I don't think is on this record, but as you were mentioning Skinner and Dos Passos and looking at these people, I was wondering, was Dos Passos an honorary member and the only non-science member of the organization?
Well, he and
you might say a little about establishing the Pavlovian Society as one of your
Well, to answer the question whether Skinner is an operator, I don't think Skinner consciously deceives people. But Skinner has a tremendous facility of talking, and he's very attractive. And that
believing what he says.
What?
And believing what he says.
Yes, and people naturally flock to that, and I think Skinner reacts to it, and I think Skinner enjoys that kind of adulation, and he plays into it, but I don't think he is an operator I don't think at all in the category of Neil Miller.
This was a facetious play on words to reveal his operant condition.
Yes, well, that's what I took it to be. But the Pavlovian Society, well, Liddell and Liddell was one of the other persons who had been working about as long as I, or even he started a little earlier in this country working on conditional reflexes at Cornell. And Liddell and Skinner and well, especially Liddell and I wanted to form a group of people to meet and discuss conditional reflexes. Now, there was no society in this country at that time where there was any kind of forum to discuss conditional reflexes on the basis of what we were doing, what Liddell and I were doing. And so we got together to start a group, and the idea was at first that it would meet in the 3 laboratories at Cornell and in Baltimore and down here. And there were just a few people who were doing that specific kind of work. Then later, I had the idea that of expanding it to make it interdisciplinary, and to include people from several different domains of interest, and to strike a kind of a balance in the society and keeping it to small numbers, 125, 150 domestic members, among groups of chosen from internal medicine, from cardiology, from physiology, from psychology, and then with some other people who from some other disciplines. I also had an idea that to have a healthy society, you should have younger people who are active in doing the work, and also have mature people who, some of them may not be still active experimentalists, but that you shouldn't have all just people that are older and that really cease to do experimental work. And so that was my conception of the Pavlovian society. And then after a great deal of mulling it over and advice from other people, I got the journal started called Conditional Reflex. I've had some reluctance to name it Conditional Reflex because it seems to be naming it too much for a method, and I didn't want to I felt that it shouldn't be tied to a method. But the publishers wanted that name. There's some division among the people in the Pavlovian society whether that's the best name for it or not. But I have felt that we should start with a journal publishing first-class articles, and that even if we have to delay an issue, we shouldn't take inferior articles. We have the Conditional Reflex Journal goes pretty much all over the world. We even have the library in Peking subscribes to it. And people, we get articles from all over the world. I'm embarrassed when I get from a professor in Europe, I get an article which is really so bad that they couldn't publish it. Murphy was telling me he publishes a number of articles, and I asked him about his request for reprints. He said he got more requests from what he published there than from other journals.
Well, I think one good thing about the name Conditional Reflex is it definitely makes clear what the main contents of the journal are, so people are not confused about what they're going to find in the journal. And this isn't a bad.
Well, we have articles that really don't have anything to do with Conditional Reflex.
But the main focus is still there.
Because it's unique. The name is unique. Yes. And it is different in that way. But I've had people tell me that I've spoken to about articles say, well, my work doesn't have anything to do with Conditional Reflex.
Right.
Horsley, to get back to the beginning point, what are your What are your activities now? What are you accomplishing these days?
Well, I don't know if I'm accomplishing anything, but my interest, my research has been rather reduced on account of facilities, and I'm interested especially in pushing and continuing the work on the kidney and to see how it relates to the heart. And I also have I want to summarize my work over from 1922, which is 50 years. I would like to take enough time to write that up. I have in mind, and which I've had in mind from 1942, I mentioned this in an article called Measures of Susceptibility to Nervous Breakdown, founding a movement for a prophylactic psychiatry. Now, we don't have any real prophylactic psychiatry, and I think that it's very much needed, and I think we have some indications from work that there is possibility to start a rational prophylactic psychiatry.
You working on an autobiography too, or is that?
Well, yes, I have that in the back of my mind, and I'd like to do that. I want to do the other part first, and it would be fun to write an autobiography and talk about the things that have seemed important for you in life, and it would be fun to do it. Writing takes a lot of time and energy, but I've always, in my life, for some reason, I've considered my work, I've taken my work more or less as play, and it's like a game, and research work is like a game. It's finding the pieces of a puzzle that fit together and make the picture. And so it's always been that game that has kept up my interest. And I suppose another quality is that of curiosity and wonder. Now, I don't think Pavlov ever lost that quality. Sherrington talked about wonder, how it is a quality of investigation, and he says you have it as a child, and then as an adult it tends to disappear, and you accept things in a stereotyped way. But he says later on in life, now he was writing about this, I think he was 85, a little bit older than I am, but he says it returns later in your life. And I think that's a great quality of, that's really what keeps you going, unless you're doing it as a profession and to make money. The wonder and curiosity is really what keeps you going in research. Now, I remember one time in the lab, about 5 or 6 years with that, Pete, I like to hear different points of view and I'm willing to give anybody a hearing, although he may appear to be pretty flimsy and not to have very much, but still I'd like to hear what he has to say. And I think you were there when I invited a person who was speaking on a biochemical or more dietetic basis for schizophrenia. And his idea was that most of...
Randolph?
Yes, I don't want to mention his name. I think we better mention his name, don't you, Phil? And so you do remember that instance. Well, Dos Passos was there too. Now, most of the people who heard him thought thought that he was just not worth listening to, and that it was rubbish. Now, I don't know, he may have something, but Das Passus was there, and he didn't think much of it. And he said that he made an observation, which I think has some truth in it. He said he had noted with the great scientists that they had a sense of play all the time in what they were doing. And that this person didn't have that sense of play, that he took himself so seriously. Now, I think you do find that most good scientists really have that sense of play and fun in what they are doing. And I think if you don't have fun in it, well, I would guess that you better be in something else. And it is what has kept me going all the time. It's this fun and kind of wonder, like reading a detective story for people who like detective stories, and or like a mathematical puzzle. It's the fun of how is it going to turn out, and what are you going to get from it. But
we've kept you here for a long and very productive session. I think we need to take a break and let you go out for a 5-mile run, and then we'll have Dykman talk to you about your scientific work in more detail.
yes. Well, I don't know how Dykman feels. I'd rather just go on through with it.
Well, Horsley, it's good to continue this conversation and have a chance to talk to you about your research. Do you think...
Oh, this morning it's going to be about research, is it?
Right.
Well, you are qualified to talk about that, since you one of my chief research collaborators, starting in, when was it, 1950?
1950, it's longer ago than I care to remember.
50 to 72 is 22.
I probably did the most significant work I ever did when I was working with you. I used to be somewhat frustrated about the fact that all I had to do was to do research. And I remember you telling me one time how lucky I would be, how lucky I was to have no other responsibilities than that.
Well, I would consider that the work that you did on the 3 intensities and the heart rate was perhaps the most important, one of the most important items of research that have come out of my laboratory. The other was on blood pressure,
Yes.
which was one of the first times, I think, that it had been definitely shown the change in blood pressure to excitatory and inhibitory stimuli. Another important point that came out of your research was the retention of these heart rates over a 13-month period, wasn't it?
Yes, that was very interesting.
Yes.
The way these dogs that we could condition over a year previously and then bring them back in the laboratory and find the response still there a year later.
Yes.
You know, I've wondered about, in talking to medical students and talking to people, it's always impressed me that it's difficult for them to appreciate the significance of Pavlov's contribution. Physiologists have been slow to pick this up. Some of the textbooks have not acknowledged this to the degree that I think they should have.
Well, the physiologist, of course, recognized his work on digestion, but that was done so long ago that it's almost forgotten. Now, he got the Nobel Prize for his work on digestion, which was given in 1903, and was the first Nobel Prize in physiology.
Mm.
But but since then, Pavlov has been known chiefly for his work on conditional reflexes, and that is omitted now in many of the physiological textbooks.
Omitted?
Yes.
Why?
Many of the physiological textbooks, you don't find any mention of Pavlov, and even though there may be a section on conditional reflexes, there's no reference to Pavlov in some of them.
Well, why do you think this is?
Well, it's hard to analyze, and I haven't made any special attempt to analyze it, but I think it's partly because there's a very strong school of psychology in America, and they have gone back to their own roots and origins, which have come from Thorndike and through Watson and Skinner, and has been a different branch from the Pavlovian. And because it's taken that different turn, they either don't want to or don't see the connection with the really basic Pavlovian work. And I think many of the psychologists, not the top ones, certainly Skinner recognizes the importance of Pavlov. He has talked to me about it, and but I think many of them who are less historically minded just consider, well, Pavlov did this work many years ago, that's all, that's passé, now we're going on to something else. Don't you? Now, you are closer to psychology and their opinion. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I've tried to think about the difference between the two approaches, the Pavlovian approach and the more traditional psychological approach. One seems to emphasize that whatever gets reinforced or whatever is rewarded will be stamped in, and that this is an excellent way of modifying or shaping behavior. The other emphasis seems to be, the Pavlovian emphasis seems to be more just things get stamped in as a result of being put together. I really am, it seems like one has more appeal to the average mind than the other. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, as Pavlov pointed out in 1922, he acknowledged Thorndike as the creator of the idea of the conditional reflex in his work in Animal Intelligence in 1898, I think. But Pavlov said, and also Pavlov spoke about Watson, and but Pavlov said there was a very different approach to the subject between the Americans and him. He said the Americans had always been practical, and they were looking for the practical side of conditional reflex, while he was more interested in the physiology. Now, I think that still characterizes two schools. Americans want something they can use quick and get results. Skinner gets his results in many ways through I mean, it's a quickly applicable thing, and if you take some of the modern Americans who are trying to use the Pavlovian method, what do they want? They want a method that will quickly cure heart disease, that will modify all of the viscera. And they neglect to do what Pavlov did, to study the laws of the visceral actions and functions. And they rush on to, well, how can we modify the heart beat and the blood pressure? And the same difference exists now that Pavlov pointed out in his book was published in 1922. There's one that I'm referring to. And that same difference exists. There are people, as you know, Neil Miller and his school, who very much want to modify renal function, cardiac function, and of course that's what the public wants. I mean, they are just looking for the Messiah of the viscera. And they can't wait for a patient study of the basic laws.
Well, you know, in talking about Pavlov to medical students, you explain or describe in some detail his early solitary conditioning work. sometimes, and some students will say, well, so what, you know, all that you've shown is that a dog can be taught to slobber to a signal. So, you know, sort of like what Bernard Shaw had to say, that any Bobby knows that much about dogs. They fail to grasp in the enormous significance of what he was about, which I think you've hinted at in talking about basic laws of conditioning and learning.
Well, Pavlov considered salivation simply a method for qualitative measurement. It was simply a kind of a yardstick, and it wasn't that there was salivation to the signal for food. It was what you could do with this method in studying the laws of cerebral action that Pavlov was interested in.
So it was the laws, and of course, it was the laws that the main emphasis was on, and of course, people often forget that the salivary response is an autonomic response, and that so, in a sense, he was one of the first to be investigating, or the first to be investigating conditioned or learned changes in the autonomic nervous system.
Yes.
And it's just as significant to look at salivation probably as it is heart rate in terms of discovering laws.
I'm now trying to write an article. It's been 72 years since Pavlov discovered the conditional reflex. And Pavlov lived the first half of those 72 years. He died in 1936. I'm trying to write an article showing how Pavlov himself modified his ideas and got them away from the stereotyping with which he began, and which might have encrusted his concepts, and comparing how he himself changed his concepts in the first 36 years with the changes that have occurred in the second 36 years.
Yes.
Now, it's very interesting that Pavlov made many modifications in his own theories and concepts, and much of the work that has come after him in the second 36 years has simply been asking the same question that Pavlov asked at the beginning of the first 36 years. Now, it's very important in science what question you ask of nature. Of course, that is what opens up a new field. Now, Pavlov asks a fundamental question. How can the autonomic function be modified by the external environment? And how can it be measured? Now, that was an important question.
Right.
Now, Pavlov began with certain ideas which were drawn largely from the current neurophysiology. But Pavlov modified in the facts that he saw, he modified his ideas considerably on the basis of the observations that he made. Now, if you take what has been done in the second 36 years, if you will analyze it, you will find that many of the people who are even studying autonomic function, that they are still, as it were, asking the same question that Pavlov asked. Can the autonomic function be modified by the external environment? And they're not asking a new question. And what they're doing is giving various elaborations and of that same question that Pavlov put to nature.
Yes.
And in that way, they may be refining in a detailed way, and perhaps it may be important. The answers that Pavlov got to his question, but they are stereotyped in that they're not asking any new question. And in that way, they are not pioneers in the sense that Pavlov was.
Yes, I agree. Let us talk for a few minutes about your early work. When you first came to this country and started the Pavlovian laboratory, what were the things you concentrated on immediately?
Well, what I concentrated on at first, I began with the study of some drugs, amytal and caffeine.
Excuse me for interrupting. Did this sort of open up the whole field of psychopharmacology?
I don't know that opened it up. I worked on drugs off and on throughout the... Well, I came to the Hopkins in 1929. That's roughly 42 years ago.
Yes.
And I've been working off and on with drugs, but I was very much interested in what were some of the quantitative relationships between the conditional reflex and the unconditional stimulus. And I did what Pavlov had not done, measured the amount of secretion to the amount of food that was given, and so that I got the curve of both the conditional reflex and the unconditional reflex. Well, Pavlov had gotten the unconditional. It's amazing how, even with some great people, they leave some little thing untouched and not worked on, which is very important. And Pavlov had not solved that relationship of the conditional reflex, which is an exponential curve.
So what you're saying is you worked on really two things at the beginning of your research at Hopkins. One was the laws governing the formation of the conditional response. And you found that the conditional response was proportional to the magnitude of the amount of food given or the unconditional stimulus. I believe you did some work relating to the intensity of the conditional stimulus and found a similar kind of relationship there, that the response...
Well, no, I had done some work in Pavlov's lab on that. Pavlov himself was very much interested in that factor. But I very soon got into cardiac work, even in the 30s. And because I was interested in how did the heart rate change with the conditional stimulus. And I very soon also got into the affected person.
Right.
Because now I think although the cardiac change was not, in a sense, a new question put, because it was still an autonomic function. It hadn't been worked on at that time. And I began in the 30s and published the first paper in 1939 with Hopman, who came to work with me from Norway, on the relationship between the cardiac function and the conditional reflex. Now, the physiologists at that time thought that there wouldn't be any change in heart rate. I asked a number of physiologists to what they conjectured would be this change, and they said they didn't. Well, there wouldn't be any change.
So they were saying, in effect, that through you could produce changes in heart rate mainly by giving food or shocking a dog or scaring him, but you couldn't condition those changes.
Yes, that there wouldn't be any change with the conditional reflex.
Right.
Now, Hoffman, who was experienced in physiology, he at first didn't want to work on this problem when he came in 1939 to work with me, because he said, well, you knew there wouldn't be any change, but I persuaded him to work with it, and we found very definite respiratory and cardiac changes. Then the other problems that I got into at that early time were the parts of the reflex arc that were responsible for the formation of the conditional reflex.
Now that work began very quickly. That even began before the cardiac work, didn't it?
Yes, that began about 1932.
So what you're saying is right off the bat you got into four fields. One were the laws of the conditioning having to do with the intensity of the conditional stimulus. The other was the psychopharmacological work. The third was the neurophysiological work directed toward finding out what the nervous system had to do with conditioning. And the fourth was this cardiac conditioning, cardiovascular conditioning. Let's go back.
The reflex arc.
Let's go back.
The reflex arc, the parts of the reflex arc.
Right.
The essential parts.
Okay, let's talk about that. What were the main findings that came out of that work?
Now, there's one more field I should mention then, because it began then, and it went on for 15 or 20 years, and is still going on to some extent. Laux and I were working with 3 dogs with the intensity of conditional reflex and the ability of the dog to differentiate. Well, now, this was a problem that didn't have anything at all to do with what came out of it. Now, we found that with those 3 dogs, one of them, Nick, who is better known in most countries than I am, formed many neurotic symptoms that continued through the rest of his life. So I got into, as it were, through the side door without directly studying experimental neurosis. I got into the problem of experimental neurosis also beginning in the 30s.
Right. And you actually studied heart rate changes in Nick at that time.
Well, yes, I studied heart rate changes as part of the experimental neurosis.
So
but
cardiac work.
it's interesting to remark that although I've studied many neurotic dogs, I've never consciously produced a neurotic state in a dog. It's always the neurotic state has been produced in the course of some other problem.
So the implication of this is what? That you're going to become neurotic if you're destined to become neurotic, or?
Well, it's partly the genetic factor that development of neurosis depends upon the type more than it does upon the procedure.
You don't think that the experiences that the dogs were subjected to in the laboratory are in and of themselves a sufficient basis for producing a neurosis?
Not unless you have that type of dog. And in that way, it is a different idea from what Pavlov had, in that you could produce an experimental neurosis by a difficult differentiation between excitatory and inhibitory stimuli.
Don't you?
And I showed that it was a matter of type of dog and also some relationship to the person, more than this, what Pavlov thought, a conflict between excitation and inhibition.
Pavlov didn't also recognize the type of dog as being important?
Yes, he represented, after the flood in Leningrad in 1924, he represented type as important, but he still thought that the most important thing was the conflict between excitation and inhibition.
So he really did put a little more of his emphasis on the environmental part rather than the temperamental part, although he recognized both aspects. And you put more emphasis on the temperamental part.
I would say that I certainly put more emphasis on the genetic and type. It's hard to say which Pavlov put more on, but Pavlov certainly recognized Pavlov was a great observer. And he recognized the importance of the type of dog after the flood, which disturbed some dogs and not others.
What new principles have you come to as a result of your, all your work, and especially your work on experimental neurosis?
Well, in experimental neurosis, it's about the predominance of the type, the affected person, the experimenter himself on the animal, the fact that sexual symptoms arise as part of a complex, and that the neurotic symptoms don't come out of the sexual system per se, which is somewhat anti-Freudian, I think. Of course, these are dogs we're studying. The persistence and difficulty of curing these neurotic states over a long period, the importance of the affected person in treating these animals, and change of locality, as changing from Baltimore to the farm. Now that, as far as neurosis...
What about the affected person? What do you mean by that? I'm not...
Well, the person... Pavlov himself took great pains to separate the experimenter from the dog, and he used a soundproof camera. Now, we have shown more specifically
what the effect of the person is, that it changes the heart rate, that it changes the reactions of the animal, that it may have a greater change in the heart rate and blood pressure of the dog than a powerful drug like atropine.
Was this different for different people and different dogs?
Yes, different it was.
In other words, if I go in and the dog sees me, he's going to maybe change his heart rate more than if you go in.
Yes.
Or if I pet him.
That is not understood why, but it just is.
Different is the same.
Even though the dog may never have seen two people, they may be two strangers, but they have a different effect on the dog.
So the same thing is true in human relations. In any two people that get together, they have different effects on each other.
Yes.
And
Now that is a kind of innate, not understood relationship.
Would you think this is, what do you think of this in relationship to psychotherapy? Affect a person?
Well, I think it's very important, and I think some work has been done, I know in Baltimore by Astrup, and may have been done in other places, that some people are more successful with some types than other people in treating patients. Did you want me to say briefly what other things that are importance of my work?
Yes, I'd like very much for you to say that.
I think then in the study of the heart rate, which is adding another system to the salivary and the motor, and it's important to add more systems because what may occur in one system you may not see in another. By comparing the cardiac changes with the motor and the salivary, it was noticed that there's a great difference. The salivary, the cardiac form very quickly. They may form after one repetition of the bell and the food, or the bell and the shock, whereas the lifting of the leg and the salivary secretion may take a week or more to form in a measurable, to a measurable degree. But on the other hand, the cardiac, if you let a dog rest, and the salivary and the motor reaction will disappear from the rest, the cardiac may continue for a matter of years without any repetition.
Yes.
Which shows that on the one hand, it's very quick to form. On the other hand, and paradoxically, it takes a long time to disappear or even to eradicate. Now, these extremes are noticeable not in all dogs. All dogs don't form it after one repetition, and in all dogs it doesn't continue for 3 or 4 years. Now that difference between systems, such as the salivary and the motor on the one hand, and the cardiac and the respiratory on the other, is what I have called schizokinesis. There's also noticed that if you let a dog rest after subjecting him to a certain procedure and study him later, you may see different relationships, different, that is, different new neurotic symptoms arising in different systems that were not there before. You may see a dog that only showed a disturbance in his external behavior and in his salivation at first, and you let him rest for a couple of years, and you may see that there is a neurotic disturbance in his genitourinary system and in his gastric juice and in his sexual system. Now, it seems to me that there is a kind of an interaction among the nervous centers for these different systems, an interaction in the brain with the focus of the whole neurotic state in the brain. And that you can get interaction in the brain and new symptoms formed on the internal side, just as you can get new reactions to the external environment formed. Now that is what I call autokinesis. Now this can be an improving, can go in an improving direction or in a destructive one. So in that way you can have a positive or a negative autokinesis. Now in the last 2 years, in studying another system, the kidney, in the difficulty of forming renal conditional reflexes, I have been struck with the fact, on thinking over what does the function of an organ mean, that different organs don't form conditional reflexes to the same degree, or perhaps not at all. And for this, to express this idea, I have used the term organ system responsibility, meaning that each organ in the body has a responsibility to the total organism, and that you can't push it very far away from performing this function. And this I consider a very important idea in conditional reflex, and that it points to the fact that you must study the physiology of the system that you are dealing with, and not consider that everything must act in a stereotyped way.
So we have 3 principles: schizokinesis, autokinesis, and organ system responsibility, which are rather new principles. And how do these relate to homeostasis?
Well, I think organ system responsibility is part of what produces homeostasis. And without organ system responsibility, you wouldn't have homeostasis.
Okay.
Now, schizokinesis apparently would be acting against homeostasis. It seems to be a dysfunction. Now, I'm not too positive about that, because I think we don't know enough about the whole physiology of the organism, and that it's very difficult to say what is good function and what is not. But apparently it is the splitting up of the organism, so that here is a basis for the formation of diseases such as hypertension, and that this would seem to be a destructive function which is against homeostasis. Now, of course, homeostasis doesn't do everything. I mean, we all die, and there comes a time when homeostasis breaks down. And so this may be a built-in kind of dysfunction of the organism which is acting against homeostasis. Now, autokinesis has been studied very little. We know the fact, but we don't know the mechanisms, and we don't know how it is expressed. And I look on autokinesis as one of the most productive new fields that can be undertaken in our domain. But I think it will be very difficult to discover methods by which to study it in a scientific way.
So the schizokinesis thing, too, goes back to your early observations on experimental neuroses, that once these symptoms are produced, they're very difficult to remove.
Yes.
And once you condition a blood pressure change or a heart rate change, then these changes tend to be very persistent, and they're very difficult to reverse by life experiences.
Yes.
So that is the principle.
Yes.
That relates back to your early work on experimental neurosis.
Yes.
So,
and as your work and my work on the persistence of these changes in cardiac reaction showed, these things last a long time without any repetition. Now, they may be appropriate or they may be inappropriate. If they are inappropriate, it would be the basis for disease. Now, the body can't do everything the best way that has to be done.
I would like to ask you to go back just a minute now. We've talked about principles, and we'll come back a little further. By the way, these lights are a good unconditional stimulus, aren't they? Powerful. I'd like to ask you, going back on the psychopharmacological work, what is the basic principle that came out of that work? I want to sort of skip through all the areas and pick up some of the major principles that came out of each area. Having to do with perhaps the peripheral versus central.
One thing about the action of drugs, which Paulworth has shown, and I can't take credit for it ourselves, is that the drug, the action of the drug is very much related to the type of dog. Now, I have used drugs in two ways to see to what degree they can act as unconditional stimuli on a basis to form conditional reflexes to them, and in another way of how they affect conditional reflexes.
Mm-hmm.
Drugs, some drugs will affect conditional reflexes in a different way from what they affect the unconditional reflex. Now, meprobamate has a tendency to increase heart rate, the resting heart rate, but on the other hand, it decreases the cardiac conditional reflex, which means that in the learned reactions, the cardiac component of learned reactions will be less than it is normally. This would give the deduction that meprobamate decreases the anxiety component of learned reactions.
In the sense that the cardiac conditional response is kind of of anxiety, a measure of anxiety?
Well, I think it can be. I mean, I think in a certain type of patient, the cardiac component can be excessive, and it can represent part of an anxiety reaction. Now, meprobamate, we've studied that more particularly than other drugs, because it may hold for other drugs too. And in the study of the action of drugs on neurotic dogs, it's very clearly seen that the drug is fitted to the dog. Now, for example, in one of our neurotic dogs, V3, that we studied for 15 years in the laboratory, from the time of his birth to the time of his death, he was a catatonic dog. Now, phenobarbital didn't have much effect on him, and whereas meprobamate made him almost like a normal dog. Now, that work was done by Dr. Newton in our laboratory in Baltimore.
I would have thought that one of the most important things that came out of your work on drugs was the fact that if you had a way of studying the effect of the central peripheral effect, that it was...
Well, the drugs were just used as agents in that study.
So,
I mean, I just consider the way we use drugs, we used a number of them, but that they were used as agents, as we used also other agents. We used electric shock to peripheral nerves.
but there wasn't one idea that you could condition that if a drug had central effects, you could condition it. If it didn't have central effects, you couldn't.
Yes, that was very clearly brought out in our work, that you cannot condition the effect of a drug when it acts, when the effect that you're studying is produced by peripheral action without involving the central nervous system.
Yes.
But I consider that the drug was just one of a number of agents that we used for that.
Right. Now, on the neurophysiological studies, the parts of the nervous system essential to the formation of the conditional response, what were the major findings in that area?
What's that?
On the neurophysiological part, the work you did with Laux and Brogdon, and what were some of the major findings there?
You mean in studying the parts of the reflex arc?
Yes.
Well, the evolution of that, I suppose I'd always, since I was working with Pavlov, I'd always had an interest in, well, what parts of the reflex arc are responsible for the conditional reflex. Laux had been an engineer, came to work with me from Minnesota, and he had an idea, rather ingenious idea, of putting buried little lumps of iron filings that would attract magnetic electric current, and would little beads that would destroy certain parts of the nervous tissue. And in that way, he was going to destroy sections, areas in the brain. Now, talking to him about that idea and about the transference of the electric current through induction, I was very much interested in studying parts of the reflex arc. So I said, well, why not use these buried coils of the windings of the wire to take up current and to stimulate different parts of the brain, and in that way to map out parts of the reflex arc that are essential for forming the conditional reflex.
So the idea was to bury a coil in the brain someplace, and by inducing some kind of a current outside the head, stimulate the current in that coil, which would then stimulate a certain part of the brain.
Yes, actually the coils were subcutaneous, put under the skin on the skull, but the electrodes went down to the different parts of the brain.
Yeah. Okay.
And in that way, we began to stimulate the motor area of the dog's brain, where you'd get a movement, to see if that could be conditioned. Now, at the same time, as part of that work, and it shows how from different areas and different stimuli of thinking, they all play on the same thing. A medical student came to me and wanted to do some research, and he wanted to repeat the work of Curare on that Horler and Stagner had done, showing that under Curare, if when the movement was prevented, that you could not get conditional reflexes. Well, I said to him, I don't know why, he must have doubted the work, but because he wanted to repeat it. And I said a much better way to eliminate the external movement would be to crush the anterior nerve roots to a leg. And because Curare can have a poisonous effect. And so we operated on 4 dogs, crushing the anterior nerve roots to eliminate the movement to a leg. And we did the training while the dog couldn't move the leg, and showed that after the regeneration of the nerve, the dog could lift the leg to the stimulus, showing that the movement was not necessary for the performance of the conditional reflex. Now then, that eliminated that part of the arc, the peripheral part.
So even though the dog couldn't perform the movement, you blocked the possibility of performing any movement, the conditional response still developed, because when the nerves regenerated, the response was there.
Yes. Now,
so you trained the dog when he was paralyzed.
Yes. Now we eliminated the sensory periphery by using these induction coils, putting them on posterior nerve roots on the posterior columns of the brain, of the cord, and with Brogdon up into the cerebellum, and showing that you could form the conditional reflex without the sensor. Well, then you can form the conditional reflex without the motor movement, and you can also form it without the sensory part. So it shows that the conditional reflex formation is a central phenomenon, and is not dependent on the sense organ, nor the movement, nor the executor organ.
Right. So it's clearly something that's formed within the central nervous system.
Yes.
So really two things came out of this work, as I would see it. One was the idea of stimulating the brain directly electrically, which is a big thing these days. It was sort of a pioneering effort in that direction. The other was perhaps identifying the central nervous system as a target organ for all the implantation studies that have been done over the last 10 or 15 years. The literature in that field is absolutely tremendous. So these were really two really very early pioneering efforts in this direction.
First, Delgado has made a great deal of these stimulating the various parts of the brain.
Right.
I don't think he ever referred to this early work of Leib's and
Well, it was probably the first work in this country that was done on that, wasn't it?
Well, I don't. It was probably the first work of stimulation with buried coils through induction, I would guess, because, of course, Fritz and Hitzig back in 1870 stimulated the motor areas of the brain, but they didn't use it in a chronic animal.
Right.
And this was using it in an animal over a large part of its life. These animals would tolerate these coils for a long time. So that constituted my work on the elements of the reflex arc, showing that the conditional reflex is essentially central formation and can be independent of the external environment. And the sense organs are very useful in relating what's going on in the external environment, which you can form a conditional reflex without them.
In hearing you talk, Dr. Gantt, and in working with you for years as I did, I get the feeling that the most exciting part of your work to you was probably the cardiac work. Is that true?
Well, I think it was. It was a new field entirely, and probably it was. And hardly nobody was working in it then. And it's interesting to work in a field where no one is working. Now, I have very much less interest in working in what everybody's working on. Now, a lot of people like to jump on the bandwagon and do what everybody else is doing. But I prefer to open up new fields and where no one is working. The disadvantage is that no one pays any attention to it. And
Dr. Miller.
What?
Neil Miller.
They just consider it a fad or something way out, and so that is a disadvantage. But it certainly is exciting and interesting, and you find out, what you find out, other people are not finding out. And what you find out in doing what everyone else is doing, it's just a little more added onto the pile.
I'd like to know, from your point of view, now Miller is doing all this so-called exciting work that has a tremendous impact on the public in terms of, well, you can take a patient who has hypertension and decrease his blood pressure through conditioning. Now, of course, we've more or less demonstrated the same thing, using Pavlovian techniques, but it doesn't seem to have the same degree of excitement to it, our work, as his does.
Well, he promises something. You see, he's going to cure, he has a very ample means of propaganda and of getting it to the press. Second, people were not ready for it when we were. You see, if the public is not ready for your work, they don't pay any attention to it. It's neglected everywhere. And therefore, people were not ready for our work. I mean, they were not ready to receive it because it was so new. They just couldn't accept it and couldn't incorporate it into their thinking. Third, you see, Miller subtly promises, well, I'm going to cure all these cases of high blood pressure, that I'm going to cure epilepsy, I'm going to cure renal disease. Well, in a very subtle way, he promises the public pie in the sky, that he's going to, by this method, he's going to cure all the psychosomatic disease and also all the visceral disease. Now, a person with high blood pressure, they'll grasp at any straw. They think, well, this is wonderful if I can get cured this way. If you promise, look at the people that fell for this Kerberos cure for cancer. If you have a serious disease and somebody says, well, I can cure it, naturally it will excite a lot of attention. Well, also look at Neil Miller. Look at his advantage. He comes from a Rockefeller University, and he's on the board of a lot of publications, and so people think his work is bound to be correct and sound, and that there's something in it.
Well, whether his work is sound or not, only time will tell. You wonder why, what he has to gain or lose by not being at least cognizant or taking recognition of the work that preceded his work.
Well, that's a personal problem. I think we'd have to talk to him and ask him why it
We
is.
ought to have him here to ask him.
One thing you could say about Neil Miller, about his claim, he claims that, he doesn't, of course he doesn't mention our work or any previous work, so he doesn't compare it, but he claims for his own that it's a new method through operant conditioning.
Yeah.
So that would be his answer. Well, I don't deny your work, but you haven't shown through the same method that I'm using, you haven't shown that it can be controlled.
Do you really think there is a difference between Pavlovian type conditioning and Skinner type conditioning?
No, not essentially.
How do you look at that issue?
Well, I discussed with Skinner. For example, a lot of Pavlovian work includes the operant element. For example, part of the time I was working with the food conditioner reflex, I'd have the dog open the lid to get the food. I did it not from an operant standpoint, but because I wanted that recording of his movement. And the lid wouldn't be fastened, but it would just balance, would keep it down and could be easily lifted. And, well, as I discussed with Skinner, that's an operant conditioning.
Well, I used to talk to you a great deal about Hilgard's book on conditioning when I was working for him in the lab, and Hilgard made this distinction between classical conditioning, which was Pavlovian conditioning, and instrumental conditioning, which was more in the tradition of Bekhterev and Thorndike. And I remember you had some feelings about that being a rather inappropriate term for these same reasons, that Pavlov in effect did do these other kinds of conditioning.
Yes.
And that it wasn't fair to assume that he just did this one kind of conditioning.
Yes, Pavlov did. Pavlov did what was in having the dog break the current when he lifted his leg. They consider that operant. So Pavlov used that method.
So you don't think classical conditioning is a good term?
Well, I never used it until I sometimes use it now. I don't think I don't see the justification for making two rigid categories. I think you should describe, as you know, you should describe the method that you're using, but whether to consider one extremely different from another, their basis, that's another thing. And some of the Russians don't think there's a difference. Svatyan wrote an article for our journal stating that they were the same.
When I talk to people about these two kinds of conditioning, psychologists in particular, they seem to be saying, well, one type depends on pairing and contiguity, and the other type depends on reinforcement. I'm never quite clear what they mean by reinforcement because it's defined so many different ways. But
Well, which type depends on
the
reinforcement?
Skinner, Miller
What about giving the dog food? Isn't that reinforcement?
Yes, I don't see the difference myself. I just, wondering if you have any feeling about it.
You can classify anything in different ways if you want to. But the question is whether a classification has any real meaning.
There also been a little bit of question about the term conditioned versus conditional, which...
Well, Pavlov used conditional, and so I feel it's more, I think it's a better term, because Mossman said to me, he was giving a lecture in Baltimore, and he said, I've never seen a conditioned reflex. And I said to him, would you say that you've never seen a conditional reflex?
Well, he couldn't answer that. He didn't want to answer.
There seem to be some subtle implications to this that escape me completely. I've never quite understood the strong feeling that in some quarters for one...
Well, I don't have any very strong feeling, but Pavlov used... There were two terms in Russian, and Pavlov used the term that means conditional. The way condition got into English is because Pavlov's work came into English through the German, and the German language doesn't have any clear-cut distinction between conditional and conditioned. But I just think that conditional is a better term for the reaction, and Pavlov used it, and so therefore I use it without trying to force other people to use it if they don't want.
Just one other thing I'd like to just touch on a moment, and then I think, we've pretty well covered it, unless you have some other things to say. And that's the way you work with your collaborators. I was one of your collaborators, so I know the way you work with collaborators, and I always felt that I was treated very fairly. I came to the laboratory, you outlined some projects that I could do. You didn't tell me I had to do any of them. You said, pick one, and you supported me in that choice. And you made me the senior author of all the papers that came out on that project. So I thought I was treated very fairly. Is that the way that you operated in general with collaborators, and is that the way Pavlov operated?
Yes. I feel that the work of a laboratory should be integrated, and that much more is accomplished. If a person comes to work in a laboratory, he comes to work there primarily because of what our laboratory stands for. There's one question I'd like to ask you. I have, not so much recently, but perhaps in the 30s and 40s, heard my work referred to as perhaps not clean work and not statistically verified, and I have a very good reason for why I've done the work in that particular way. My reason is that I work more on a clinical basis, where you study one animal, one individual, in a very prolonged and careful way, and you don't go in for numbers and statistics. The other is that I have in mind asking an important question of nature, and when I feel that I have enough material to answer that, I'm satisfied. But now, what would you say about you're very well aware of both methods of working, the psychological and the way that I work, and what would you say of the methods?
I would say that the Russian method, the Pavlovian method, which I think you've generally followed in your research, is based on it's a longitudinal type of approach in which you study single cases over long periods of time. And that approach doesn't lend itself very well to statistics. It's another completely different kind of approach to a problem. My statistical approach is to take a large number of animals to sort of pick out one variable and to attempt to arrive at some deductions on that basis. I think both approaches are...
Yes, I want to say something about the difference. My feeling is the most important part of science is to ask a proper question of nature. Now, I'll tell you an anecdote to illustrate that. When Dean Chesney was dean at Hopkins, a medical student came to him and said, Dr. Chesney, I'd like to do some research work in his free quarter. And Chesney said to him, well, what do you want to work on? What are you interested in? He said, I don't care, just research. Chesney said to him, go down Monument Street and count the bricks in the houses. Now that could have been made into a statistical survey. Now I'm writing a scientific...
He sent 3 or 4 other people down to make count the blocks.
Well, I'm interested in writing a scientific autobiography, which I'm going to call Don't Count the Bricks.
Don't count the bricks.
Because it means ask the proper question of nature.
I think you know that the psychologists like Spence would say that they are, he's not there, but we're asking proper questions of nature, and they were doing it from a statistical quantitative point of view. I think you can answer appropriate questions of nature from a statistical point of view. But I agree with you 100% that the research should be directed, whether it's statistical, longitudinal, cross-sectional, or whatever, should be directed toward answering, asking an appropriate question of nature.
Well, every human, for example, is different from every other human. So if you take 100 humans, you're not taking the same material.
True.
So you can't apply the same statistics to them. I mean, when it's just like, just like taking 50 humans and 50 dogs. They are 100 items, but the material is so different. But the statistics won't give you any important question. Well, I don't want to bring up a debate here, but I just want to say to you what I feel is a justification of the method that I use.
Well, I feel that the method you use is extremely appropriate, and it answers the questions that have to be answered, and that's all there is to say about it. Let me just conclude this thing by saying that publicly, and if this is publicly, that the years that I spent with you in the Thought Welding Laboratory were the most enjoyable years of my life and the most productive, and it's been an experience which I shall never forget. And I thank you very much.
Reciprocate that.